So let's talk about the prerequisites for this MoonDream AI series of classes. Basically, what do you need to come into this series to actually be able to take something away from it? The big thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with MoonDream AI is that this is a back-end system. So a lot of times when people talk about artificial intelligence at this point, they're talking about going out there and using ChatGPT or Claude or Google Gemini. They sit down at their computer, they bring up a website, they tap in whatever their query is, and they get a response back and they go, "Yay! I'm using AI," which sort of, I guess they are. But as I say, as the phrase goes in Silicon Dojo, bro, do you even API? We're not here to basically use somebody else's pre-built system. We are real technology professionals and use things like APIs. And basically what I mean by that is we are going to be using MoonDream AI as we use the other systems that I talk about in these different classes in a back-end capacity. So what's going to happen is we are going to install the MoonDream AI package into our Python environment, and then from there we're going to use the MoonDream model to be able to interact with images and be able to ask MoonDream different things about those images. Again, what is in the image, XY coordinates, that type of thing. So the important thing to understand here is that we're going to be using MoonDream within a Python environment. So we're going to be using VS Code and we're going to be using Python to, again, interact with MoonDream. So the first prerequisite here is you will need a basic understanding of how Python works. You will need to be able to write some very simple Python code. To be honest, you can do a lot of copy and paste here, but it is one of those things. You do need to know what you're copying and pasting. So if you copy and paste something wrong, you know where to go in and close the quotation mark or whatever else. But basically, you just need to know it at a very basic level. Past that, from a knowledge standpoint, it does get to be a bit more of a complicated topic, right? So basically, what we're going to be doing is we're going to have Python and we're going to have our images. And so what we're going to do is we're going to say in our Python script, we're going to say, "Hey, MoonDream AI," we're going to ask a question about this image. MoonDream AI is then going to process that image and we are going to get a response back. So we have text going in essentially to MoonDream AI, and then we have text coming out, which might be useful, but also is probably boring as hell, right? So the thing is how do we make it sexy, right? There's a difference between making something functional and making something useful. Right? And so that's one of the things you're going to need to be thinking about is to use MoonDream AI to make something useful. That is where you're going to need to know more concepts in technology. So Bottle Web App Framework is a standard Python web app framework we use for a lot of projects here in Silicon Dojo. So it would be wise to understand Bottle Web App Framework so you can use Bottle in order to create a web application that is able to use the power of MoonDream. So you can create your own interfaces and that type of thing. Along with that, understanding HTML and CSS would be very useful. On top of that, again, if we're making a request and we're getting responses back, we're interacting with text, right? That is very useful for creating records in a database. So again, SQLite is the standard relational database we use at Silicon Dojo. So going through our SQLite class, structured query language and SQLite class, that would also be a very valuable thing for you. And so that's where we're starting to get with some of these classes now with Silicon Dojo is it's like to understand this series of classes, you basically only need a simple, very, very simple understanding of Python. You just need to understand the basics. On the other hand, to build something useful with this technology, that's when you start to layer all the other different technologies on top. So that's basically where we're at. As we go through this series of classes, I'm going to show you how to do everything in Python. We will use some HTML and CSS, but again, you can copy and paste it if you don't understand to go along with that. But then once we get into our labs and we start trying to build something relatively practical, that is where we are going to add the Bottle Web App Framework. We're going to add SQLite. We're going to add in different components components like that. So at that point, you might want to go and do a refresher or go through some of the other series, series of classes to fully understand what we're talking about. Now, as far as hardware goes for running the labs in this series of classes, or just in general running MoonDream AI, one of the cool things about MoonDream is that it's actually designed to be used on low resource systems. So the idea is you should be able to run it on a Raspberry Pi and have it run relatively well. So the results that you will get on a low resource system should be fine, though I will warn you, it might be a little slower than you're expecting. When I was doing testing, again, we have our good old classic 2012 MacBook Pros, dual core, like 1.5 gigahertz processors, 4 gigs of RAM, and the largest model from MoonDream AI worked perfectly fine on here. Again, was a little bit slow, but honestly, it was the same way when I was running it on my my M2 Max MacBook Pro that's only a year and a half old. One of the things I will tell you with this series is MoonDream in general seems to run a little slow regardless of the hardware you're running it on. So don't necessarily think, oh, this is running slow, let me go out and buy a $4,000 computer and that'll fix everything. You might be sad with what the results are. If for some reason your computer isn't running fast enough in order to be able to deal with MoonDream, MoonDream does allow you the ability to interact using an API. So mainly in this class, what we're going to be focused on is running MoonDream locally, because I think that's the most interesting concept. But they do have an API as I'm recording this. You get 5,000 requests per day for free, and it actually is pretty fast. It's a hell of a lot faster than running it on my local system. So if you do run into an issue and for whatever reason MoonDream locally is running too slow, just change out the code. We'll show it to you in one of the next classes. Change out the code so instead of running locally, you're running off of the API, plug in an API key, and basically at that point MoonDream should be able to run on almost any system that's been around, you know, in the past 20 years. So as far as hardware is concerned, you should be fine with almost anything that you're going to be using.